Imagine finding yourself in a life where everything you once knew begins to crumble. Frank, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for his wife, Janice, faces an impossible choice. His mother's disdain for Janice's condition and her ulterior motives push Frank to make a heartbreaking decision. As Janice, once a vibrant and ambitious woman, finds herself abandoned in a remote village, hope seems lost. But what happens when the tables turn? When Janice, thought to be helpless, rises above her betrayal? This story takes you on an emotional journey, from the depths of despair to the heights of unexpected triumph. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Frank, do you even comprehend that we can't go on living like this any longer? The woman asked, lifting her head with a sharp urgency in her voice. She's become an unbearable burden on our lives. The man glanced at his mother, torn between defiance and overwhelming guilt. His usually soft and gentle face was now twisted with sorrow. His hands fluttered aimlessly, betraying his inner turmoil, and he couldn't bear to meet his mother's piercing gaze. "But Mom, Janice is my wife," he finally uttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of loyalty and despair. The woman threw her hands up in exasperation, her eyes narrowing with cold detachment. "Oh, please, if you truly cared for her, you wouldn't have another woman in your thoughts. And let me make one thing clear, I'm not going to be her caretaker. She's practically a vegetable now, and you heard the doctor's prognosis, she won't survive beyond a year. So, what's the use of prolonging this agony? I think it would be best for her to stay with her grandmother. There, maybe she can reconnect with her roots, perhaps recall some faint memories of her past. Besides, there's a silver lining: you'll inherit a decent sum once she's gone, which could finally pull us out of this miserable situation." Frank's gaze lingered on his mother as he sighed deeply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The following day, every bag and suitcase containing Janice's belongings were lined up in the hallway. Mrs. Pickles stood there, a cruel smirk playing on her lips as she watched her bewildered daughter-in-law. Janice, a delicate young woman with soft blonde hair, sat forlornly in her wheelchair. At just 27 years old, her life had taken a devastating turn when a sudden stroke robbed her of her mobility and her voice. Now, she spent her days confined to the wheelchair, her silence as heavy as the grief that had settled in her heart. While Frank was away at work, Mrs. Pickles assumed the role of caregiver, though it was clear to Janice that her husband intentionally stayed late, dreading the thought of returning to a home filled with his wife's helplessness. Mrs. Pickles had never been fond of Janice, finding her ambitions and drive to be an affront to the traditional role she believed a wife should play. To her, Janice's focus on her career was a betrayal of her duties to her husband. Janice had once been an assistant to the director at a prominent company, with dreams of one day running her own business. But those dreams were shattered, just like Mrs. Pickles' already fragile sympathy for her daughter-in-law. If Mrs. Pickles had merely been a nag before the stroke, she had now become a tyrant, barking orders at the mute Janice, ignoring her silent pleas, and often neglecting her basic needs. The only solace Mrs. Pickles found was in Janice's silence. At least now, she couldn't interfere with her revisiting the plays she once starred in during her days on the stage. As Frank struggled under the weight of the heavy suitcases, beads of sweat forming on his brow, Janice sat motionless against the door, her face a mask of silent despair. Her eyes, swollen and red, brimmed with tears that threatened to spill at any moment. The sight of her belongings being loaded into the car filled her with a growing sense of dread, but she remained voiceless, trapped in her mind. "Don't worry, dear Mrs. Pickles said with a smirk that twisted her lips into a cruel grin. "The doctor mentioned your heart is fragile, and the fresh air in the countryside will do you good. Who knows? You might even make it through the year, Haven't you always dreamed of returning to your granny's old house in the village? A whirlwind of thoughts raced through Janice's mind, each one more furious than the last, but her body betrayed her. The words she longed to scream at her mother-in-law were trapped behind the cruel silence that had become her prison. If she had her voice, she would have unleashed a torrent of anger and sorrow, telling this old, gray-haired woman exactly what she thought of her heartlessness. "Frank, dear, what's taking you so long, Mrs.?" Pickles called out, her voice dripping with feigned concern as her son stumbled in, breathless and exhausted from the weight of the bags. "The elevator's out of order," Frank panted, his chest heaving. "I had to haul everything down from the 20th floor." Mrs. Pickles shook her head, casting a disdainful glance at Janice. "I told you we should have hired movers," she said, her tone laced with reproach. "Mom, you know we can't afford that," Frank replied, his voice tinged with frustration and fatigue. "Oh, sonny, Mrs." Pickles sighed, her voice turning wistful as she reminisced. "There was a time when I graced the theater stage every night, performing for packed houses. Your father used to rush over after his lectures just to watch me shine under the spotlight. Who could have ever imagined that I'd end up here, changing diapers?" She shot another withering look at Janice, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain, before lapsing into silence. Just then, the neighbor emerged from the building, interrupting the tense moment. "Good afternoon, Mrs." Pickles, the neighbor greeted with a nod. "Are you off somewhere?" Mrs. Pickles plastered a wide, artificial smile across her face. "Hello. Yes, we're taking Janice to a boarding house for rehabilitation. The doctor says it should do wonders for her." The neighbor frowned slightly, shaking her head. "That must be quite expensive." "Oh, it is, Mrs." Pickles sighed dramatically, her voice laced with false martyrdom. "But what can I do? I can't leave my poor daughter-in-law without proper care. After all, she's done so much for us." The neighbor added a few more pleasantries before continuing on her way, leaving Mrs. Pickles' face to transform from one of feigned sympathy to stern displeasure. She turned to her son with a sharp frown, her voice clipped with irritation. "Let's get this over with before the entire building catches wind of what we're doing. We should have done this first thing in the morning." Frank picked up the heavy suitcase, his patience wearing thin. "It's cold in the morning," he retorted, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "It's 4 in the afternoon now, and I'd rather not lose any fingers to frostbite." Without waiting for a response, he marched toward the car, leaving his mother standing there, her face flushed with indignation. Frank was the only child of Mrs. Pickles and her late husband Michael, and had been the center of their universe. Born when they were already well into their 40s, they had both paused their careers, his mother, a celebrated actress, and his father, a respected law professor, to pour all their energy into raising him. The result was a sheltered and timid Frank, who, now approaching 40, still lived under his mother's roof, working a dead-end job where he was routinely belittled by his boss and barely tolerated by his colleagues. 20 minutes later, Janice was finally loaded into the car, along with all her belongings. Frank carefully placed her in the back seat, followed by her folded wheelchair. Tears streamed down her face, her silent sobs shaking her frail body. "Janice, please try to calm down," Frank whispered gently, fumbling with his seatbelt. His voice was low, almost as if he were trying to console himself as much as her. "You'll be taken care of by a neighbor over there, Mrs." Pickles interjected, her tone matter of fact. "Naturally, we'll be paying her from your funds," she added with a dismissive wave of her hand. Frank sighed and nodded in agreement. "You know, we're not exactly rolling in money right now," he murmured, almost apologetically. "It's the best option for everyone. You'll be more comfortable there." Janice gazed at her husband, searching his pale, drawn face for any trace of compassion or reluctance, hoping to find some sign that he was struggling with this decision. But there was nothing, no flicker of pity, no hesitation. He was as cold and distant as ever. The car pulled away from the curb at precisely noon, leaving behind the place that had once been their home. Mrs. Pickles, satisfied that the deed was done, waved them off with a curt nod before heading back inside. She couldn't wait to sink into her favorite armchair, playbook in hand, where she could lose herself in memories of her glory days on stage, imagining the applause of an adoring audience that had long since faded into the past. Frank sighed deeply and pressed down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed as they left the city behind. He avoided looking in the rearview mirror, where Janice's tear-filled, swollen eyes seemed to silently accuse him. "Janice, please try to understand," he began, his voice strained with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "I don't have any other choice." For a moment, he could have sworn that her expression shifted, a mocking eyebrow arched as if to challenge his words. But when he hurriedly wiped his foggy glasses and looked again, all he saw was her sorrowful, devastated face. "My mom. She's just trying to make things better for us," Frank continued, his words sounding hollow even to his ears. "She's right, you know. I can't take care of you all the time. I have to work. And Mom, well, she's not as young as she used to be. You'll be better off here with your nurse. You'll be back in your grandmother's house, the one you always spoke about so fondly." He fell silent, turning his head away from her piercing gaze, but he could still feel it like a physical weight on his chest, squeezing his lungs until his breath came in short, quick bursts. It was as if her silent anguish was seeping through the thin fabric of his jacket, suffocating him. The drive to the remote village, where Janice was to spend the remainder of her days, was long and oppressive. The village itself was desolate, with only a few scattered houses lining 2 dirt roads, a single rundown store at its center, and a decrepit medical office that had been closed for years, a casualty of the area's neglect and abandonment. Frank's dark blue car slowed as it approached a small, weathered house with an overgrown garden and a fence that was falling apart. The house, though worn, still stood in relatively good condition from the outside. The garden was wild, with century-old trees looming over thick, untamed grass that reached higher than the fence in some places. In front of one of the windows was an old, sun-bleached bench, and on it lay a figure, barely moving. As Frank busied himself with pulling Janice from the car and unloading her wheelchair and belongings, Janice stared fixedly at the figure on the bench, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar silhouette. The person stirred, muttering under their breath, and slowly rose to an unsteady stand, staggering towards the gate. The woman's face, etched with deep lines and sagging skin, was framed by a tangled mess of hair. A fading bruise marked one eye, adding to the haggard appearance. She was dressed in a bizarre combination of clothing: a yellow t-shirt, green shorts that were far too light for the chilly weather, and worn-out pink shoes adorned with dull rhinestones. You're here early," the woman stammered, her voice shaky and uncertain. Frank frowned slightly and turned to Janice, forcing a smile. "Janice, this is your nurse. Her name is P. She's going to be taking care of you now." P nodded in confirmation, though the gesture caused her to wobble slightly, as if the simple act of standing was a challenge. Frank finished unloading the suitcases and carried them into the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. Before leaving, he discreetly handed P a thin envelope, its contents modest, yet sufficient to bring a look of gratitude to her weary face. As Frank returned to the car, he couldn't bring himself to look at Janice again. He mumbled a quick goodbye and climbed into the driver's seat, his heart heavy with the burden of what he had just done. The car's engine roared to life, and he sped away without a backward glance, leaving Janice and her uncertain future behind in the rearview mirror, along with any remnants of his conscience. Frank stood before his wife, letting out a heavy sigh. "Janice, why do you look so upset? I'm sure deep down you're happy. After all, this is your childhood home," he said, glancing around at the neglected property with its wild, overgrown garden and the broken gate that barely hung on its hinges. Fresh air, constant care, what more could you possibly need to be content? Janice's mind raced with 1,000 things that would truly bring her happiness, but, as always, she remained silent. Her eyes, however, spoke volumes, glaring at Frank with a fury that words could never fully capture. Each piercing stare was loaded with the weight of her unspoken anguish and betrayal. Frank felt a brief twinge of guilt deep in his heart, but the memory of his mother's practical advice and the figures in Janice's bank account quickly smothered any remorse. The allure of her money was too strong, and it dulled whatever empathy he might have felt. He climbed back into the car, forcing a smile as he waved at Janice through the window. P shuffled closer to Janice, offering Frank a feeble wave of her own. "Don't worry, Frank, everything will be just fine," P slurred, her voice thick with the telltale signs of inebriation. Frank managed another strained smile before turning the key in the ignition, and the car roared to life. He drove off, leaving Janice behind with nothing but the loneliness of the dilapidated house and the uncertain care of an alcoholic woman who could barely look after herself, let alone someone else. A year passed in the blink of an eye. One evening, as Frank sat slumped on the couch, exhausted from another day at his dead-end job, Mrs. Pickles suddenly burst into the room, her face pale with shock. "Frank, are you serious? You never once checked on your wife," she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. She glanced at the calendar on the wall, her expression turning to one of horror. "A year? Are you out of your mind? How do you even know if she's still alive? Or worse, what if she somehow managed to get out of that wheelchair?" Frank, startled, tore his eyes away from the television and looked at his mother, the realization hitting him like a cold slap. He had never once visited Janice in all that time, not even to check if she was being properly cared for. His mother's shock quickly turned to indignation as she continued to berate him, but Frank could only sit there, his mind clouded with the uncomfortable truth that he had abandoned his wife entirely. "EP calls me every week. She assures me everything's fine. I send her money every quarter, so just relax," Mom Frank replied, trying to dismiss his mother's concerns with a wave of his hand. Mrs. Pickles snorted in disbelief and marched over to the couch where Frank lay. With a swift motion, she snatched the remote from his hand and turned off the television. "When I'm talking to you, you'd better give me your full attention," she demanded, her voice rising in a dramatic flair that she often used to command a room. "P, do you mean that same drunkard you left in charge of your wife? Are you convinced she's taking care of Janice and not just spending the money you send her on booze? What if she hasn't even seen Janice in months, while you lie here watching TV, oblivious?" Frank rolled his eyes, clearly exasperated. "Do you want me to go see her tomorrow? Fine. I'll spend my one day off driving to that backward village to visit my half-dead wife." "Yeah, Mom, you care about me," he replied sarcastically, punctuating his words with a loud, dismissive snort. Mrs. Pickles, her patience frayed, threw the TV remote at her son in frustration and stormed out of the room, muttering a string of harsh words about him as she left. The next morning, Frank begrudgingly packed a few belongings, grabbed an envelope filled with cash, and headed to the car. He glanced wistfully at the clock. It was just 7 a.m. He could still be in bed, but instead, he was being dragged to that wretched village. As much as he wanted to dismiss his mother's fears as baseless, Frank had spent his entire life obeying her every command. The drive was long and tedious, made worse by the broken radio that left him in the oppressive silence of the early morning. He could barely remember the route to Janice's childhood home. He had always handed the money to P in the city, where she would take the bus to meet him and collect the envelope. Frank had only been to the village 3 times, once when he had first left Janice there, once when he had been car shopping in the area, and once when Janice had proudly shown him her childhood home during their early days of dating. To his surprise, when Frank arrived, he found the house looking different from how he remembered it. The fence, which had once been old and decrepit, was now almost new, and the garden, although overgrown, had been trimmed not too long ago. Frank frowned as he got out of the car, the unease in his chest growing stronger. He carefully opened the gate and called out for Janice and P, but there was no response. The silence was unsettling. Frank approached the house, intending to go inside, but the door was locked. He tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed P's number, but there was no answer. He rubbed his forehead in agitation, glancing around the eerily quiet property. For the first time, his mother's suspicions no longer seemed so far-fetched. A knot of dread began to form in his stomach as he realized that something was very wrong. Despite knowing that P was unreliable, Frank clung to a thread of trust in her. He knew that her house was nearby, and with a mix of apprehension and determination, he left his car and began walking down the deserted street. In just 5 minutes, he arrived at P's house. His dismay deepened as he took in the dilapidated state of the building. It looked even worse than the neglected house where he had left Janice. As he pushed the creaky door open, a rancid odor assaulted his senses, forcing him to pinch his nose shut. Inside, P was slouched over a large round table, sipping a strange yellowish drink. Her disheveled appearance and the empty bottles scattered around the room confirmed his worst fears. Without hesitation, Frank grabbed her by the arm and dragged her outside into the daylight. "Where's Janice?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Who? P responded, her voice loud and slurred, her bleary eyes struggling to focus on anything. It was as if she was staring straight through him, lost in a drunken haze. "Where's my wife, you useless drunk?" Frank shouted, his patience snapping. "Ah," Janice P muttered, her memory finally kicking in. "She doesn't live far from here." "Show me," Frank ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. They walked along the empty, desolate road, Frank growing more bewildered with every step. He was taken aback as they approached a large, well-maintained house that starkly contrasted with the surrounding decay. The house was enormous, with 3 stories, a grand balcony, and a sprawling garden. Multiple cars and pieces of farm equipment were parked in the backyard, a sign of prosperity that was out of place in the otherwise run-down village. P stopped a short distance from the ornate wrought iron gates and pointed ahead. "She lives there now," P mumbled, then turned and stumbled away without another word, leaving Frank standing in stunned silence. Frank was momentarily frozen, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with the reality he had known. How had Janice ended up here, in this impressive estate? He quickly gathered himself and walked up to the gate, ringing the small bell beside it. A cheerful voice responded almost immediately, "Elliot, why are you so early?" Frank's heart skipped a beat. He was taken aback, momentarily speechless. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Janice." There was a pause on the other side of the gate, and then the voice softened, filled with an emotion Frank couldn't quite place. "Frank, come in." His hand trembled as he reached for the gate, pushing it open. He stepped inside, his mind racing with questions, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. What awaited him beyond that door? The woman he had left behind a year ago, broken and helpless, was now in this place that seemed so out of reach for the life they had once shared. As the gate swung open, Frank was greeted by a vast, meticulously maintained garden with a stone path lined with a kaleidoscope of vibrant flowers. He cautiously walked along the path, his heart pounding, and entered the house. Standing on the steps was a petite woman with blonde hair, dressed elegantly in a beige suit and shawl. She looked down at him, her face a mask of calmness, though a hint of something more flickered in her eyes. "I almost thought you wouldn't come," the woman said with a small, knowing grin. "But now that you're here, do come in." Frank was at a loss for words as he followed his wife through the house. The interior was nothing like he had imagined, tastefully decorated with soothing colors, elegant furnishings, beautiful artwork, and pristine carpets that softened each step. He couldn't help but steal glances at Janice, who looked more radiant than he had ever seen her, even before the stroke. Her pale complexion now had a healthy blush, her scarlet lips glistened with a delicate sheen, and her eyes, subtly lined, sparkled with a confidence that left him both awed and confused. This was a simple beauty, yet one that Frank had never truly appreciated before. Janice led him into a spacious, inviting room filled with comfortable sofas and armchairs. "I'll make some tea, and then we can talk," she said, her voice calm yet carrying an undertone of something Frank couldn't quite place. She left for the kitchen to prepare the tea, leaving Frank alone to absorb the surroundings. He sank into an armchair, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. The room's beauty was almost surreal, and he found himself pinching his arm just to confirm that it was all real. How could this be? He had come expecting to find his wife bedridden, helpless in a wheelchair, but instead he was met with a vision of health and grace that he could hardly believe. A few minutes later, Janice returned with a large tray, carefully balancing several cups of tea. She handed one to Frank and took another for herself before sitting down gracefully across from him. "Didn't expect this, did you?" she asked softly, her eyes studying his reaction. Frank shook his head, still too stunned to form coherent words. I didn't expect to see you like this," he finally managed to stammer, his voice shaky. Janice's expression remained calm, though a shadow of hurt passed over her eyes. "I also didn't expect my beloved husband to send me away to die just to get his hands on some money." Frank's face flushed with guilt and defensiveness. "I thought," he began, but Janice cut him off sharply. "Spare me your hollow excuses," she said coldly, her voice firm. "I know everything, Frank. You've never been good at hiding the truth. It was always about my inheritance, wasn't it? When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany. I was thrilled at the thought of the life we could build together. But then I uncovered something that made me see things differently." Frank's heart sank as Janice's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of betrayal. The serene beauty of the room around them seemed to mock him, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within. He had underestimated Janice, and now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he realized just how much he had lost. "Do you remember my friend Christina? We used to work together at the company," Janice continued, her voice carrying a mix of nostalgia and something more somber. Frank nodded slowly, recalling the tall, statuesque woman who had always exuded confidence. "Yeah, she's the one who encouraged you to change your life." Janice's mind drifted back to a pivotal moment a year and a half ago when she and Christina had shared a quiet dinner at a cozy restaurant. Their work meeting had already concluded, and they had decided to linger a little longer, enjoying the meal on the company's dime. "Dinner's on the company. Why not indulge a little?" Janice had said with a grin as she settled into her seat, feeling more at ease than she had in a long time. She then reached into her small purse, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to Christina with a nervous excitement. "Take a look at this. Do you think it's true?" Christina eagerly opened the envelope and scanned the letter inside. "Who is Annie Reuter?" she asked, curiosity piqued. "My grandmother," Janice explained, her voice softening with the memory. "My father's mother. She married a German man when my father was about 6 or 7, and they moved to Germany. My dad returned here later and met my mom. The last time I saw my grandmother was at my father's funeral. She wanted me to go back to Germany with her." "And why didn't you go?" Christina had asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I couldn't leave Frank," Janice had replied, the weight of her decision evident in her tone. "He has his mom here, his job. And I never really dreamed of living abroad." Christina had looked at Janice with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "You're incorrigible, Janice. You passed up a golden opportunity for an exciting life in Germany because of an ordinary man." Janice had smiled at Christina's words, but deep down, they had struck a chord. She had always been the kind of person to put others before herself, to sacrifice her dreams for the sake of those she loved. At that moment, sitting in that restaurant, she had wondered if she had made the right choice. Had she given up too much for a life that didn't truly fulfill her? Now, sitting across from Frank in this grand house, Janice could see how those words had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. Christina's blunt honesty had opened her eyes to the possibilities she had been too afraid to consider. And now, with everything that had happened, Janice realized that she had finally taken control of her destiny, even if it had come at a great personal cost. Looking at Frank, she could see the confusion and regret etched on his face. She knew he didn't fully grasp the significance of what she was about to reveal, but he would soon enough. "Christina made me realize that I was settling for a life that wasn't truly mine. I was living for you, for your mother, for everyone but myself. But when I received that letter, I knew it was time to reclaim what I had given up." Frank remained silent, his mind reeling as Janice's words sank in. He had never imagined that his once submissive wife had harbored such thoughts, let alone acted on them. As he sat there, facing the woman he had so gravely underestimated, he felt a cold dread settle over him, knowing that the comfortable, predictable life he had envisioned was slipping away, replaced by a reality he was entirely unprepared for. Janice rolled her eyes, well aware of Christina's blunt opinions about Frank. It wasn't the first time she had heard her friend criticize him, and she often chose to ignore her remarks. Christina had always been known for her sharp tongue, a trait that had earned her a successful career but left her with few friends. Most people couldn't handle her unfiltered honesty and had distanced themselves over time. "Your Frank would probably sell his mother if it meant getting his hands on some cash. Do you even realize how much your grandmother left you?" Christina asked pointedly, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in closer. "There was a letter included with the will," Janice replied calmly. "She wrote that I was her last living relative and that she would be dividing the inheritance between her husband's children and me. From what I gathered, the sum is quite substantial, and there's also a share in an estate in Germany." "Do you have to go there to claim it?" Christina inquired, her curiosity piqued. "No, according to the instructions in the letter, I can accept the inheritance here. The notary will come to me personally to finalize everything," Janice explained. Christina snorted, clearly unimpressed. "I can only imagine how thrilled Frank will be when he finds out. He's always been obsessed with the idea of money, starting his own business, but unlike him, you have the brains and skills to make it happen." "Don't talk about Frank like that," Janice interjected, a note of defensiveness in her voice. "He's a good man, he's just had a string of bad luck." Christina burst out laughing, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Bad luck? Sure, let's call it that. But let's be honest, his biggest misfortune is having that wretched mother of his around. I still don't get why you live with her. You could have moved out ages ago." Janice shrugged, trying to downplay the situation. "Mrs. Pickles can't live alone. She's never been used to it, and honestly, it's not that hard for me to put up with her." Christina shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. She took a sip of her wine before responding, "Well, let me give you some advice. Whether you want it or not, don't breathe a word about that inheritance to your husband. If you do, they'll either push you into an early grave for that money, or they'll start pretending to care, only to bleed you dry of every penny." Janice bit her lip, knowing that Christina's words, harsh as they were, carried a certain truth. The idea of keeping something so significant from Frank felt wrong, but at the same time she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that her friend's warning wasn't entirely unfounded. Christina's skepticism about Frank's intentions gnawed at her, adding another layer of complexity to the already tangled emotions she was grappling with. Janice slapped her palm on the table, her eyes narrowing as she shot a menacing look at Christina. "Frank and I love each other. Nothing like what you're suggesting is going to happen. You have too low an opinion of my family." Christina merely grinned, a knowing smile that lingered on her lips, but she decided to change the topic rather than continue the argument. That same evening, Janice returned home, eager to share the news of her inheritance with Frank and his mother. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Pickles even brought out a bottle of expensive wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and for the first time in a long while, Janice felt a sense of unity within the family. Christina's warnings seemed baseless. Perhaps her friend had been too cynical, too quick to judge. With Mrs. Pickles no longer nagging her and Frank spending more time with her, Janice's spirits were lifted. Feeling optimistic, she decided to buy Frank a gift, a new tie from a men's clothing store. As she stood outside the shop, gazing at the display, she was so lost in thought that she barely noticed her surroundings. It wasn't until she turned her head that she saw him, Frank. Her heart leaped with the intent to call out to him, but her voice froze in her throat when she noticed a young woman approaching him. Frank embraced the girl and kissed her passionately, oblivious to the world around him. Janice staggered back, her hand instinctively reaching out to steady herself against the shop window. The scene before her was surreal, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her loving husband, the man she had defended so fiercely, was betraying her right before her eyes. Numb and shaken, Janice chose not to confront them. Instead, she quietly returned home, slipping into bed early, her mind whirling with disbelief and pain. The following morning, Janice took a day off from work and headed to a local detective agency. She entered a dimly lit office where a short, thin man with glasses sat behind a small table, casually sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. Without hesitation, Janice sat down across from him and explained the situation. "I want to know everything: how they met, where they go, where they sleep, the places they date. I need to know everything." The next week was an agonizing period of uncertainty for Janice. She wrestled with the truth she had uncovered, unsure of how to process it. The thought of telling Christina gnawed at her, but she couldn't bear the idea of hearing the inevitable, "I told you so." Yet deep down, Janice knew Christina had been right all along. Christina had always seen through Frank, refusing to be Janice's maid of honor at their wedding, a decision that had deeply hurt Janice at the time. Though they had eventually reconciled, the wound had never fully healed. Now, Janice was beginning to understand that her friend's harsh judgments had been rooted in genuine concern. A week later, Janice received a call from the detective. She found herself back in his office, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The detective leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "You know, you're lucky that your husband's mistress is quite the talker," he said, amused. "I spent almost a week following her around, talking to her friends, and I managed to piece together everything. Her name is Aisha Selick. She's 22 years old and a recent graduate of a pedagogical college. She met your husband a few months ago, likely at a coffee shop." Janice nodded, her expression hardening. "Thank you for the information. Do you have any evidence? Like a video?" The detective's grin widened as he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a large, old-fashioned tape recorder. Janice's eyes widened in surprise. It was a relic from another era, something she hadn't seen since her childhood. She hadn't even realized such machines were still in use. The detective twisted a knob, and the recorder whirred to life, emitting a loud, crackling sound as it played the recording. Janice listened in silence as the tape hissed and popped, the unmistakable voices of Frank and Aisha filling the room. The recording was raw and unfiltered, capturing moments of intimacy that made Janice's stomach churn. Every word, every laugh, every endearment was a dagger to her heart, confirming the betrayal she had feared was real. As the recording continued, Janice felt the final threads of her old life unraveling, leaving her in a painful but necessary clarity. The woman who had been blindsided by loyalty and love now sat in that small, dimly lit office, preparing herself for the inevitable confrontation with a man she could no longer trust. "Frank," a high-pitched female voice exclaimed from the crackling recording. "Is this for me? Oh my goodness, it's beautiful. It must have cost a fortune, right?" "I wouldn't spare any expense for you," Frank replied, his voice oozing satisfaction. "Once I get my business up and running, I'll be able to shower you with jewelry like this every day." But when that girl asked, "You said you didn't have money to start your business yet," Aisha questioned, her tone playful yet probing. There was a brief silence, but Janice could almost picture Frank's smug grin. "My wife does," he finally responded. "She recently inherited a considerable sum from her grandmother. We'll use that money to kickstart the business and make a fortune." "You'll leave her, won't you?" Aisha's voice was sweet, almost innocent, but the underlying question was sharp. "As soon as she's no longer useful to me, yes," Frank replied, his tone cold and decisive. The recording continued, the voices of Frank and Aisha mingling with the background noise, but Janice had stopped listening. The words faded into the distance as her mind drifted into a storm of thoughts. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her gaze fixed on some indeterminate point in the room as the memories of her life with Frank flooded her consciousness. She recalled the first time she met Frank, how she was captivated by his gentle demeanor and the way he seemed so different from other men. At 11 years younger than him, Janice had just graduated from an economics university when Frank entered her life. He took her to cozy cafes, strolled with her through parks under the stars, and surprised her with tickets to the theater and concerts. Back then, Mrs. Pickles seemed like the epitome of sweetness and kindness, welcoming Janice into their family with open arms. Having recently lost her mother, Janice was drawn to Frank's seemingly intelligent and caring family. She fell head over heels for the shy, soft-spoken man and was eager to marry him despite Christina's warnings. Christina had been against the marriage from the start, sensing something off about Frank, but Janice was too blinded by love and new emotions to heed her friend's advice. Memories swirled in Janice's mind, memories of picking out Frank's wedding suit together, sorting through their wedding gifts with joy, and the overwhelming happiness she felt in those early days of their marriage. She had been so sure that this happiness would last forever. Even though Frank never shared her passion for business and career aspirations, preferring the traditional path of family and children like his mother, Janice believed they could find a balance. She wasn't ready for children yet. She wanted more out of life, more for herself. But now, all those dreams and hopes had crumbled in an instant. The man she thought she knew, the man who had never once raised his voice at her, had been plotting to use her inheritance to fulfill his ambitions and then discard her when she was no longer needed. The betrayal was so profound, so utterly incomprehensible, that Janice felt as if she had been struck by a physical blow. She sat there, staring at the wall, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she had just heard. The detective watched her in silence, understanding the gravity of her situation. He had seen all kinds of reactions in his line of work once. A woman had flown into such a rage after discovering her husband's betrayal that she smashed his office window with a chair. But Janice was different. Her devastation was internal, a quiet, seething pain that seemed to freeze her in place. After a few minutes, the detective stood and retrieved a glass of water, handing it to Janice. She accepted it and drank it in one smooth motion, her thoughts still racing. As she put the empty glass down, Christina's words echoed in her mind, words she had dismissed at the time, but now seemed chillingly accurate. Frank would sell his mother for money, Christina had said. Janice had laughed it off then, but now, with the truth laid bare before her, those words took on a horrifying reality. Everything Christina had warned her about was true. and Janice was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her life, unsure of what to do next. In the clever mind of the deceived wife, a plan began to take shape, dark and meticulous. A vicious grin curled across Janice's lips, and the detective, who had been observing her closely, instinctively took a step back. He had never seen such an expression on her face before, one that was a mix of pain, resolve, and a hunger for retribution. A few months later, Frank's dark blue car pulled away from the gnarled fence behind which he had left the supposedly disabled Janice. As soon as the car disappeared from view, Janice rose from her wheelchair with deliberate calm. He, who had been standing nearby, gawked in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of Janice effortlessly standing after what was supposed to be a debilitating stroke. Janice said with a cold determination, "Let's make a deal. I'll pay you the same amount my husband does, but in return, you will not tell him what you've just seen." P nodded, still dazed and unable to find her voice. "Good," Janice continued smoothly. "We'll be great friends. Here's your first payment." She handed P a stack of bills. "You'll return every month, and I'll give you more money. In exchange, you must continue telling my husband that my condition hasn't changed and that he doesn't need to visit. Is that clear?" P snatched the bills with trembling hands, nodded quickly, and without another word, turned and hurried away, not daring to look back. Janice, now alone, went inside the dilapidated house to change out of the clothes that had been part of her charade. Inside, the house was as neglected as one might expect. Dust coated every surface, furniture was draped with cloths, garbage littered the floor, and one of the windows had been broken, likely by local children looking for mischief. Janice walked over to an old, red sofa, pulled off the protective fabric, and sat down heavily. A cloud of dust rose around her, but she didn't care. She pulled out her phone, which Mrs. Pickles had somehow overlooked, and dialed the one person she could still trust. "Come," she said simply. "Everything happened exactly as you predicted. I'm waiting." After hanging up, Janice set the phone aside and lay down, her mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts, some coherent, others just a blur of emotions. An hour and a half later, after Janice had managed to clean the house a bit, the door creaked open and Christina walked in, holding a small grocery bag filled with wine and takeout provisions for an impromptu celebration. "Good thing you brought wine," Janice said with a weary smile. "I don't think I would have made it through the day without it. I still can't wrap my head around the fact that they left me here to die, all based on a hastily concocted diagnosis. It's beyond belief. They heard I didn't have long to live, and instead of questioning it, they started celebrating. Where was the concern for verifying the so-called diagnosis by Dr. Grimes?" Christina shook her head, setting the bag down as she joined Janice. "They didn't want to think twice about it," she said bitterly. "The diagnosis was convenient for them, so they accepted it without question." As they ate, they pondered the next steps. "I'll stay here for a month or two, until I figure out my next move," Janice said between bites. "For the first time in my life, I have no plans. It's a strange feeling." "And what are you going to do here?" Christina asked, surveying the old, abandoned house and the overgrown garden. "This place doesn't suit you at all. You're not the type to hide away in a remote village." "If I throw myself back into the chaos of life too soon, I'll have a nervous breakdown," Janice explained, her tone calm but firm. "I need this time to calm down, to think. Besides, I haven't had a real vacation in years." Christina shrugged, feeling uncharacteristically unsure of what to say. From the very beginning, she had disliked Frank, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. She had even refused to be Janice's maid of honor, joking that Frank seemed the type who would sell his mother if it benefited him. Frank had always struck her as a weak, spineless man, stuck in his dead-end job at the insurance company. But this leaving his wife to die was something far beyond what she had imagined, and it left her both horrified and vindicated. Christina spent the night at Janice's, keeping her friend company as they both tried to make sense of the situation. The next morning, Christina returned home, feeling uneasy about the whole ordeal. Janice, meanwhile, made a decisive move. She quit her job, severing ties with the life she once knew. Christina didn't quit hers after all. She didn't have an inheritance to fall back on. But she promised to help Janice in any way she could, knowing her friend needed time to heal and plan her next steps in what had become an unexpected and perilous journey. Janice began the new day with a cold shower, hoping to clear her mind from the fog of the last few tumultuous weeks. She had endured 3 weeks of what felt like living in hell, testing her husband's loyalty and love, only to be met with cold indifference and the expectation of her swift demise. The realization that the man she once loved was merely waiting for her to die had crushed her spirit. But today she resolved to push past the pain. Her old life was over, and it was time to move forward. With a renewed sense of purpose, Janice pulled out the money from her suitcase, which Christina had thoughtfully brought her, and decided to venture into the village. She vaguely remembered the location of the small store she used to visit as a child and set off to find it, hoping the walk would help clear her head even further. The morning air was crisp with the coolness of autumn, and Janice wrapped herself in an old coat she had found in the closet, trying to stave off the chill. Despite the early hours, the village was quiet. Most people were either at work or still at home. To her surprise, she found the store without needing to ask for directions. It looked exactly as it had 20 years ago, a relic from the past with its multicolored sign and cloudy windows displaying the counters inside. The sight of it brought a small grin to Janice's face, a flicker of nostalgia in an otherwise grim time. As she stepped inside, she was immediately greeted by the familiar scent of fresh bread mixed with the perfume that the saleswoman, Mrs. Tyler, always wore. Mrs. Tyler, hello. Do you recognize me? Janice asked, her voice filled with a hint of hope. The older woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching Janice's face. You do seem familiar, but I can't quite place you. I used to come here as a child, Janice explained, trying to jog the woman's memory. A moment later, recognition dawned on Mrs. Tyler's face. Oh, Janice, how could I not recognize you? She exclaimed, coming out from behind the counter to embrace her warmly. She kissed Janice on the cheek, her eyes sparkling with fond memories. It's been so long, and nothing here has changed a bit. I've noticed, Janice replied with a smile, looking around the store. Could you help me with some groceries? I need bread, milk, butter, vegetable oil, pasta, rice, peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and honey. Mrs. Tyler nodded but gestured towards the milk with a disapproving look. For milk, I'd recommend going to Mr. Leonard. He doesn't live far from here, and his milk is fresh, nothing like this stuff, she said, pointing to the cartons on the shelf. This has a shelf life of 6 months. God knows where it's been kept for so long. And don't forget to try his tomatoes, they're the best I've ever tasted. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted when a man barged into the store, his clothes dirty and his expression serious. Without a word, he pushed Janice aside and barked his orders. Mrs. Tyler, give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and the courier should have left my order here, a box with medicine and pest repellent. Mrs. Tyler frowned at the man's rudeness. Elliot, can't you see I'm helping a customer right now? She asked sternly. Elliot shot a dismissive glance at Janice, his impatience clear. She's a city girl. If she needs anything so badly, she can go buy it in the city. But I need my stuff urgently. Janice took a deep breath, momentarily thrown off by his arrogance, but she quickly regained her composure. She wasn't about to let this man's rudeness spoil her day. Instead, she stepped aside with a polite nod, allowing Mrs. Tyler to deal with him. As she waited, Janice's mind continued to race, the events of the past few weeks swirling around in her thoughts, but she remained determined to push through, to not let anyone or anything drag her down again. Elliot, Mrs. Tyler said, her tone carrying a note of disapproval as she fixed him with a stern look. But before she could continue, Janice raised her hand in a conciliatory gesture. "Let him go ahead, Mrs. Tyler. He seems to need it more." "Mrs." Tyler hesitated for a moment, clearly annoyed, but eventually gave in with a reluctant nod. She shot Elliot a brief, exasperated glance before heading to the back of the store to fetch the box he had requested. "Couldn't it have waited just a few minutes?" Janice asked, her voice calm but carrying a hint of irritation. Elliot, who was tall and rugged with the hands of someone accustomed to hard labor, looked at Janice with a mix of surprise and mild curiosity. His black hair was slightly tousled, and his stern gaze revealed a man used to getting his way. Despite his unkempt appearance, there was something undeniably striking about him. Janice guessed he was in his 30s, maybe nearing 40, but certainly no older. "Are you always this principled?" Elliot asked gruffly, his voice carrying the roughness of a man who wasn't used to social niceties. "I'm not in a rush, but even in the city, people observe the order of things, and they're in much more of a hurry than you seem to be." Janice couldn't help but grin, finding his bluntness almost refreshing, if not a bit abrasive. She turned away slightly, feeling the intensity of his brown eyes as they lingered on her. Just then, Mrs. Tyler returned, carrying a heavy box, which she handed over to Elliot. "Here you go. The mineral water is over there." She pointed to a far corner where the plastic packages of mineral water were stacked. "You can settle up later." Elliot nodded, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water, and without a word of thanks or goodbye, walked out of the store. "Who was that?" Janice asked, her curiosity piqued by the encounter. "Mrs." Tyler waved her hand dismissively as she went to the shelf of cereals. "He's a local farmer. His father left him a small house and some livestock, and about 8 years ago, he decided to take the farm seriously. Built it all up himself, hired some workers, and has been doing his best to make it work. He's got big plans, but for now he just plants, tends to his animals, and sells food to our store and a few neighboring villages. He's not a bad man, but he's rough around the edges. No one knows why." Janice nodded thoughtfully as she picked up her bags of groceries and headed home. The bags were heavier than she had expected, and she struggled to carry them, but she managed to make it back. The small refrigerator at home didn't look so empty now, stocked with the essentials she'd bought. Feeling somewhat accomplished, Janice then set out to get vegetables and dairy products from the local suppliers Mrs. Tyler had recommended. Mr. Leonard's place was indeed close to the store. He had a large yard, and Janice could see 2 goats grazing contentedly nearby. When she arrived, she found an elderly man busy crafting a chair in the shade of a tree. He looked up as she approached, and Janice introduced herself, explaining why she was there. "Mr. Leonard," she began, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Tyler at the store suggested I come to you for fresh milk and vegetables. I'm Janice, by the way. I've recently moved back to the village." The elderly man paused in his work, looking her over with a friendly, if cautious, gaze. "Ah, I know the Tyler woman well," he said with a nod. "You're welcome to do whatever you need. The milk's fresh from this morning, and the vegetables are just harvested." Janice thanked him and purchased what she needed, appreciating the simplicity and directness of village life. Although she had been used to the convenience of city supermarkets, something was grounding about buying fresh, local produce directly from the people who had grown or produced it. It felt like a return to something more real, more connected, a small comfort amid the upheaval her life had recently undergone. Janice, the elderly man, beamed, his thick gray beard stretching with his smile. "I'm so happy to know that you're Rita's granddaughter. I only remember her daughter." "Yes, that's my mother," Janice nodded, feeling a warm connection to the place. "So, do you sell vegetables and milk?" About 20 minutes later, she emerged from Mr. Leonard's house, struggling under the weight of 3 massive bags filled with fresh produce and dairy. It seemed the old man had taken it upon himself to provide her with enough groceries to last a month. And though Janice had felt a bit awkward refusing his generosity, her back was now paying the price. She had barely managed to walk a dozen steps before she had to set the bags down, her muscles straining under the load. As she caught her breath, a black car with a large body pulled up nearby. She recognized the familiar voice before she saw the driver, Elliot. Janice hesitated, torn between her pride and the practical need to lighten her burden. She didn't particularly want to accept help from someone who had been so brusque earlier, but the thought of carrying those heavy bags any further was unbearable. Reluctantly, she swallowed her pride. "Yeah, I don't mind," Elliot said, getting out of the car. He swiftly picked up the heavy bags, his strong arms making the task look effortless. "Serious shopping," he remarked with a smile. "Are you planning to winter here?" "No, I just wanted to get comfortable. Fry some bio potatoes, and that's it." Janice grinned, trying to keep the mood light. She reached for the smaller bag to help load it into the truck, but Elliot turned and took it from her hands. His touch was warm, and Janice froze for a moment, surprised by the unexpected connection. Elliot placed the bag in the truck and then shut the back with a decisive click. "Show me the way." "Where do you live?" he asked, his tone more courteous than before. "Sure, I'll show you," Janice replied, settling into the passenger seat. As they drove off, Elliot broke the silence. "So, you're coming to us from the city, right?" "Well, yes," Janice answered, her thoughts momentarily drifting. "And what brought you here?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I grew up here," Janice shrugged, looking out the window as familiar sights passed by. "I had some problems at home and I needed a place to be alone. My granny's house seemed like the perfect spot. I've always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful, and there's nothing here to interfere with my thoughts." Elliot nodded, understanding in his gaze as he glanced over at her. "I get that. Sometimes, getting away from everything is the only way to clear your head." Janice looked at him, surprised by the empathy in his voice. The earlier impression of him as rough and impolite was beginning to soften. "Exactly," she said, her voice more relaxed. "I just needed some space to figure things out." The rest of the drive was filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional question from Elliot about the village and Janice's memories of it. By the time they reached her grandmother's old house, Janice felt a little less burdened, not just from the groceries Elliot had helped carry, but from the realization that she wasn't as alone in her thoughts as she had first believed. "Yes, it is," Elliot replied as he drove, his speed brisk, almost as if he was in a rush. Janice quickly realized that this fast pace wasn't just limited to his driving, it seemed to be a part of who he was. Whether in the store or on the street, Elliot never slowed down much, always moving with purpose. Soon enough, they arrived at Janice's house. Elliot helped unload the heavy bags and even carried them inside without being asked. As they walked through the overgrown grass that reached up to their waists, Elliot couldn't help but comment, "Is there no one to cut this at all?" "Grandma used to do it herself, almost up until the day she passed," Janice replied, a hint of pride mixed with sadness in her voice. "She could do anything: cutting, sewing, mowing, even fixing the roof. But me, I'm just a city girl who doesn't know the first thing about any of that." Elliot paused, glancing around before looking back at her. "You're from the city, aren't you?" Janice asked, curious about his story. "Yes, I am," he answered, checking his watch. "What time is it?" "I need to go." "Sorry, I didn't catch your name." "It's Janice," she said, offering a small smile. "Janice," he repeated, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a beautiful name. Nice to meet you, Janice." "Nice to meet you too, Elliot," Janice replied, her smile growing as she watched him leave. Elliot drove off, and Janice stood there for a while, watching the car disappear down the road. She couldn't help but wonder where this unexpected new acquaintance might lead. The next morning, Janice was awakened by an unusual rumbling and a strange rustling sound. Groggy, she got up from her creaky bed and walked over to the window. What she saw made her blink in surprise. Elliot was outside in the middle of the tall grass, wielding an old scythe. The grass was neatly laid in even rows as he worked, his movements steady and sure. Despite the cool morning air, sweat glistened on his brow, a testament to the hard work he was putting in. Janice opened the window and called out, "Elliot." He paused, looked up, and took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. His gaze met Janice's, and he seemed momentarily taken aback. There she was, standing in the window in nothing but a long linen dress she had found in her grandmother's closet and decided to use as a nightgown. She hadn't had time to sort through everything yet, so she wore what she could find. "Good morning," he called back, his voice carrying over the quiet of the morning. Janice felt a slight blush rise in her cheeks, realizing how she must look. "What are you doing out here so early?" Elliot shrugged, leaning on the scythe. "Figured the grass needed cutting. It's easier to think when the place isn't overrun." Janice smiled, appreciating the gesture more than she could say. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Elliot replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But I wanted to. Besides, you said you're just a city girl, right? Thought I'd lend a hand." Janice chuckled softly. "Well, thank you. It's kind of you." Elliot nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "No problem. I'll finish up out here, and then maybe we can grab some coffee." Janice nodded, the idea of sharing a quiet morning with this unexpected but welcome visitor feeling like a nice way to start the day. "I'd like that," she said softly. As she watched Elliot return to his work, she couldn't help but feel that perhaps her time in the village would bring more than just solitude. There was something comforting about his presence, a quiet strength that made her feel less alone in her journey to rebuild her life. "What are you doing?" Janice asked, her tone more curious than confrontational. Elliot raised his eyebrows, the look on his face making it clear what he thought of the question. "I realize you're mowing," Janice clarified, "but why are you doing it in my yard?" "Do you want me to stop?" Elliot replied, his voice tinged with a hint of sarcasm. Janice shook her head, feeling slightly flustered. She closed the window, deciding not to continue the conversation. She had also noticed the way his gaze had lingered on her, assessing her in a way that made her slightly self-conscious. To avoid any further awkwardness, she quickly changed into something more appropriate and headed to the small kitchen. Janice decided to make pancakes, an unusual task for her since she rarely got up this early and wasn't in the habit of cooking breakfast. The fast-paced city life had conditioned her to often skip the meal altogether. But now, with an unexpected helper who had taken it upon himself to mow her yard, she felt the least she could do was offer him something to eat. By the time the sound of the scythe had ceased, indicating that Elliot had finished his work, the pancakes were ready. Janice stepped out onto the porch and called out to him. "Will you come in for breakfast?" she asked. Elliot shrugged, set aside his scythe, and walked towards the house. He was sweaty and tired from the work. "You can use the shower," Janice suggested, nodding towards the bathroom before heading back to the kitchen. Elliot washed his face quickly and then joined her, sitting down at the table where a plate of pancakes and a bowl of sour cream awaited him. Janice stood nearby, her arms folded across her chest, watching him. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, a note of seriousness in her voice. Elliot looked up, raising his eyebrows in mild surprise. "For what?" "Well, you didn't do it for free, did you?" For food, Elliot replied with a grin, taking a bite of the pancake and leaning back comfortably in his chair. His eyes met Janice's, and he seemed to study her, as if trying to decipher something in her expression. "Well, since you don't want to accept payment, I won't insist," Janice said, shrugging. "I'm just used to paying for any work that gets done." "Haven't you heard of the word help in the city?" Elliot asked, his tone light but pointed. Janice snorted and laughed. "You said yourself you're from the city." "Mrs. Tyler mentioned you've been living here for 8 years, so you can't exactly blame me." "I'm not blaming you," Elliot responded, his smile fading into a more thoughtful expression. "It's just that city folks are always surprised when they get help without a price tag attached. I used to be like that too." Janice nodded, understanding dawning on her. "I guess it's something I need to get used to. It's a different pace here, a different way of thinking." "That's the beauty of it," Elliot said, finishing off his pancake. "Sometimes it's nice to just help out, no strings attached. It's how we build connections out here without always keeping score." Janice found herself softening toward him, appreciating his straightforwardness. "Thank you," she said sincerely, taking a seat across from him. "I'm not used to this kind of kindness." Elliot simply nodded, his gaze steady and warm. "You'll get the hang of it. Besides, it's good to have neighbors who look out for each other." As they finished their meal, Janice realized that Elliot's help wasn't just about mowing the grass, it was a gesture of goodwill, a small step towards building a sense of community that she hadn't even realized she needed. "By the way, why aren't you eating?" Elliot asked, noticing that Janice hadn't touched the breakfast she'd prepared. "I don't usually eat breakfast," Janice replied, waving it off casually. "I always had to rush to work early. I'm just not used to it. I usually grab a snack later at the office." Elliot tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "So what kind of work did you do?" "I was an assistant to the CEO of a company," Janice answered with a hint of pride in her voice. Elliot let out a low whistle. "Impressive. Don't get me wrong. I've been making my way here, but that's a different level. I was learning how to run a business and had my dreams too. Then I had a stroke," she added with a snort, a trace of bitterness in her voice. "But that's a story for another time. Today I've got to clean the house and the attic. Plus I have a friend coming over tonight, a busy life, you know." Elliot smiled, appreciating her resilience. "I should get going too," he said as he finished his breakfast. After he left, Janice watched him walk away, trying to discern the motivations behind his unexpected kindness. Later that evening, Christina arrived, carrying bags of things Janice had requested. As she walked into the yard, her eyes widened at the sight of the freshly mowed grass. She set the bags down and called out to Janice, who was busy scrubbing the muddy windows. "I need to replace the glass," Janice said without preamble. "Where do you think I can find a handyman?" Christina grinned, clearly amused. "Why don't you ask the man who mowed your yard?" "Oh, that was Elliot, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday," Janice explained, waving the idea off. "I don't think he has time to deal with glass." "Well, he found time for the grass," Christina shrugged, still smiling. "What's this about a farmer?" Janice paused her cleaning and invited Christina into the house. "If it's not too much trouble, could you peel the potatoes? They're under the sink." "I'm exhausted," she admitted, sinking into a chair and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. Christina took off her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and picked up a knife. "Sure thing. But first, tell me more about this farmer," she said with an enigmatic smile, clearly intrigued. Janice chuckled, shaking her head. "I didn't know him before. He came here about 8 years ago, around the time my grandmother passed away. He's taken over the farm, looking after animals, growing vegetables, typical farming stuff. What else can I say about him?" Christina raised an eyebrow as she began peeling the potatoes. Sounds like he's more than just a typical farmer if he's mowing your yard and giving you rides. And now you're thinking he doesn't have time to help with a little glasswork." Janice sighed, a small smile playing on her lips. "Maybe he's just different. I'm still trying to figure him out." "Different can be good," Christina said with a knowing look. "Sometimes it's exactly what we need." Janice nodded thoughtfully, realizing that Elliot's unexpected presence in her life might be just that, something different, something she hadn't anticipated but maybe needed. "Is he rich?" Christina asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and practicality. Janice shot her a rebuking look. "Why does that matter?" Christina crossed her arms, clearly indignant. "It's important these days, you know." "Fine," Janice conceded, "but honestly, I don't know much about his financial situation. What matters is what kind of person he is." "So, what is he like as a person?" Christina pressed, sensing Janice's hesitation. Janice took a moment before responding, clearly conflicted. "He's complicated. At first he was kind of rude to me at the store, but then he offered me a ride home. And the next thing I know, he's showing up at my house to mow the grass, even though I never asked him to. Then he refused to take any money for it." "Maybe he likes you," Christina suggested with a playful grin. "Don't be ridiculous," Janice dismissed the idea quickly. "He probably thinks I'm just some clueless city girl who doesn't know how to take care of herself." "Or maybe he sees something more," Christina countered. "You should keep an open mind. For once in your life, you might end up with a decent guy who knows." "He's just a man," Janice interrupted, rolling her eyes but not entirely dismissing Christina's words. She changed the subject, not wanting to dwell on the possibility. "How's work going?" she asked. "Oh, don't even get me started," Christina groaned. "Without you, the boss has completely lost it. He's already gone through 3 assistants since you left. Turns out you were doing a lot more than he ever realized." Janice had been living in the village for a month now. She had settled into the small house, and while she had grown accustomed to the quiet life, the restlessness within her was hard to shake. She had always been driven by work, growing up in a modest household where she learned the value of hard work early on. She started working right after finishing her studies and had never taken a day off without good reason. Now, for the first time in her life, she was doing nothing. During the first week, Janice had busied herself cleaning the house and making it livable again. But once the house was in order, she found herself enveloped by an unsettling silence and tranquility. She started waking up late, something she had never done before, and spent her days reading books that Christina had brought her, visiting elderly neighbors, and listening to their stories from decades past. The unstructured days began to grate on her nerves. Adding to her unease was the fact that she kept running into Elliot. The day after Christina's visit, he had overheard their conversation about the broken glass and had come over to replace it. The next morning, Janice found herself baking a meat pie and offering him a slice as thanks. Then he came by to fix the gate, and once again, Janice cooked him breakfast. This pattern repeated itself several more times, and Janice found herself less and less surprised by the early morning sounds of Elliot working outside her window. She couldn't quite understand it. Was he just being neighborly, or was there something more to his frequent visits? Either way, she couldn't deny that his presence had become a comforting, if puzzling, part of her new routine. Elliot had made it a habit to come into the house and sit down at the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Their conversations were never long or deep, nor were they filled with the typical gestures of courtship. He didn't bring flowers, didn't shower her with compliments, and yet he was always there, a steady presence that Janice couldn't quite figure out. It was both comforting and perplexing, and she found herself wishing she could understand his motives. "Confess, Elliot," she teased one day, her voice light but probing. "You just come over to eat, don't you?" I wouldn't say that, Elliot replied with a grin, pausing mid-bite to meet her gaze. Most of their interactions were just like this, short, understated, often laced with humor. But as their routine continued, rumors began to spread around the village. Some of the local women, particularly those with an interest in Elliot, took notice, and one day, a voluptuous brunette appeared at Janice's door. "Elliot is mine. Do you understand?" the woman declared, her voice dripping with menace. "You think you can just waltz in from your city and take our men? You're delusional." With a glare, she angrily ripped a leaf off a nearby tree and threw it at Janice, who stood on the porch, momentarily stunned. The next time Elliot came by, Janice couldn't resist telling him about his ardent admirer. "Did she scare you?" he asked with a grin, though there was a hint of seriousness in his tone. "I'm not scared of country women," Janice retorted, her voice confident. "I've had grown men in suits threaten me when I worked in the city. I once refused to sign a contract from my boss, and 5 of them almost pinned me down right then and there. That's scary, not a leaf thrown by some jealous groupie of the man who, for reasons I still don't understand, keeps fixing everything that breaks in my house." Elliot simply smiled, his response a wordless return to his soup, as if her words hadn't fazed him in the slightest. But then, days passed without a visit from Elliot. Janice found herself restless, and after a while she decided to take a walk through the village, hoping to clear her mind. Deep down, she couldn't deny that she was hoping to run into him. She had grown so accustomed to his quiet presence and enigmatic smile that she almost missed it. During her walk, she ran into Mrs. Tyler, who had just stepped out of the store, her expression unusually worried. "Mrs. Tyler, is something wrong?" Janice asked, concerned by the older woman's demeanor. Mrs. Tyler sighed heavily. "Yes, Elliot's farm is in trouble. It's falling apart, and I'm afraid it might not recover. Everyone's upset. Our men and women rely on that farm for work, and if it goes under, there's no other work for them here. Elliot's always managed to scrape by, twisting and turning to keep things running. But something's gone wrong this time." Janice's brow furrowed with worry, and without a second thought, she decided to visit Elliot at his farm. The farm was about 2 kilometers from the village, a sprawling estate with a large, long building where the sounds of cows mooing could be heard. Men were working in the yard, and behind the farm, vast vegetable fields stretched out, now barren with the arrival of autumn. After asking a passerby for directions, Janice found Elliot's office. It was small, almost claustrophobically so, with just a desk and chair in the center, a closet in the corner, and a small window that let in only a sliver of light. Elliot stood in the middle of the room, hunched over papers, his lips moving silently as he calculated numbers on a small, worn calculator, making corrections to the documents spread out before him. Janice stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, her heart aching at the sight of him so absorbed in his work, carrying the weight of the farm's troubles on his shoulders. She hadn't realized just how much responsibility he bore until now, and seeing him like this, she felt a surge of empathy and something more. She stepped inside, the creaking of the door alerting him to her presence. "Elliot," she called softly, her voice a mix of concern and determination. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes before he quickly masked it. "Janice, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice steady but tired. "I heard about the farm," she said, stepping closer. "Mrs. Tyler told me you're having some trouble. I wanted to see if there's anything I can do to help." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Janice. I appreciate the offer, but this isn't something you can fix with a few hours of work. It's everything. The finances, the crops, the livestock. I'm barely keeping it all together." Janice nodded, undeterred. "I know I can't fix everything, but maybe I can help in some small way. You've been there for me, helping out with my place, and I want to return the favor." Elliot stared at her for a moment, as if weighing his options, before he finally nodded. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "Maybe you can. I could use another pair of eyes on these numbers." As Janice moved to stand beside him, poring over the papers, she realized that their connection was deepening in ways she hadn't anticipated. What started as an unlikely friendship might be turning into something more, forged in the quiet moments and shared burdens that had brought them together. Janice approached him with a soft hello, causing Elliot to turn around abruptly, letting out a sigh. "Is something broken again?" he asked, his tone edged with frustration. "I'm sorry, but it's not a good time." "No," Janice replied, her voice steady. "I heard you were in trouble, so I came to help. Is it something with the paperwork?" "It's okay. I can handle it," Elliot responded harshly, clearly trying to push her away. Undeterred, Janice stepped closer, her resolve unwavering. She almost pushed him aside to get a better look at the papers. Elliot raised his voice. "Go away, or I'll have to drag you out of here by force." Ignoring his outburst, Janice met his eyes with a determined look and glanced down at the papers in his hands. It didn't take long for her trained eyes to spot the issue's excessive spending and unnecessary costs that were bleeding the farm dry. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial expert?" she asked, her tone sharp with concern. "I'm doing quite well on my own," Elliot repeated, though the defensiveness in his voice was unmistakable. Janice arched an eyebrow, refusing to back down. "I can see how well you've been managing a fabulous spending spree to nowhere. You urgently need a specialist." "And where am I going to get one?" Elliot asked, his tone glum as if he had already resigned himself to the situation. Janice smiled broadly, pointing at herself. "I have a degree in economics. Plus, I worked for several years at a company where the costs and revenues were much higher than yours." Elliot looked at her, torn between pride and relief, before waving his hand in defeat and sitting down tiredly on a chair. He handed over the papers, and Janice began to review them with a keen eye, her mind already racing with ideas on how to cut unnecessary costs and streamline the farm's operations. Late in the afternoon, as the sky darkened and the farm grew quiet, Elliot and Janice finally emerged from his small office. The workers had long since gone home, and the only sounds were the distant calls of night animals and the rustle of leaves in the cool evening breeze. "Why do you need both cauldrons and milk delivery 3 times a day?" Janice asked, her tone still brisk from the day's work. "One delivery is enough. It can be stored in the fridge until it's picked up. There's no point in wasting money on extra trips. And there are plenty of other unnecessary expenses like that. The budgeting is just inefficient." Elliot scratched the back of his head, clearly out of his depth. "I was actually in the military," he admitted, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "Accounting estimates and budgeting are far from my expertise. My father always dreamed of having his big farm with vast fields, but it's been hard keeping it all together. I guess I took on his dream, even if it's a bit late." Janice softened at his words, realizing the weight of the legacy he was trying to uphold. "You're doing your best," she said gently, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "But you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you. Together we can turn this around." Elliot looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, with her help, he could make the farm thrive as his father had always dreamed. Janice glanced sympathetically at Elliot as they walked down the narrow path, the cool evening air brushing against their skin. The wind was blowing, but despite the chill, Janice felt an unexpected sense of calm and quiet. It was a rare moment of peace, one she hadn't experienced in a long time. "So what's the story about the stroke?" Elliot suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Janice flinched slightly, caught off guard by the question. At first, she considered making a joke to deflect, But then she remembered that she had promised to share the truth. Letting out a loud exhale, she began her story, the words coming out slowly at first. That's when I came up with the plan. Janice began, recalling the moment she and Christina had concocted their scheme. Christina helped me put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a fee, agreed to tell my husband that I was in intensive care after suffering a stroke and that I couldn't have visitors. After 2 weeks, the doctor informed my husband that there was no hope for me and that I would soon die. He said he was discharging me so I could live out my last days with my family. Janice paused, her voice growing more reflective. During those 2 weeks, my husband called only twice, and when I finally came home in a wheelchair, it was as if I was invisible, forgotten, and unwanted. That's when he came up with the idea of sending me here, thinking it would speed up the process of my death. She sighed deeply, the memory still stinging. I had hoped that seeing me on the brink of death would remind him of his love for me, that he'd call off his mistress, and that he'd start to care for me, to do everything possible to help me live as long as I could. But I was cruelly mistaken. Elliot reached out and took Janice's hand, squeezing it tightly. The warmth and strength in his grip were comforting, a silent assurance that she wasn't alone. Janice looked down at their joined hands, her heart swelling with gratitude for his support. "Why don't you go back to the city?" Elliot asked gently. "At first I thought I'd just take it easy here for a while, let things settle," Janice admitted, her voice thoughtful. "But then I realized I don't want to go back, not yet. The city, with its fast pace and constant reminders of Frank and his mother, it's not where I need to be right now." Elliot released her hand and quickened his pace, a sudden urgency in his movements. "Come on," he said, "I want to show you something." They walked for a long time, with Janice having no idea where they were headed. But when they finally arrived, she couldn't help but gasp in surprise. Standing before them was a huge, elegant house with a high fence, clearly a place of great beauty and value. "This is the house of an acquaintance of mine," Elliot explained, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "We served together in the military. He passed away recently from cancer. Now they're selling it, and I wish I could buy it back, but I don't have the money. They're planning to buy the house and tear it down to build some kind of sawmill or something." Janice's heart ached as she looked at the house, imagining the history and memories contained within its walls. "It's a beautiful place," she said softly, understanding the depth of Elliot's attachment to it. "It is," Elliot agreed, his voice heavy. "It's more than just a house. It's a piece of history, of someone's life. And it feels wrong to see it torn down for something so commercial." Janice turned to him, her eyes filled with empathy. "Is there anything that can be done to save it?" Elliot shook his head, his expression resigned. "Not unless I can come up with the money to buy it myself, and that's not likely to happen." Janice fell silent, thinking about the challenges they both faced. In that moment, she realized that they were kindred spirits in a way, both fighting battles that seemed insurmountable, both carrying dreams that felt out of reach. And yet, standing there together, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to overcome these obstacles, even if it meant relying on each other a little more than they were used to. "Do you realize that if you buy this house, there's no turning back?" Janice asked, her voice tinged with the gravity of the decision they were about to make. Elliot nodded, his gaze steady. "I don't want to go back to the city. I'm too impatient and fast for the country, but too slow for the city. It's a paradox. I can succeed here, and I can't succeed there." Janice studied his face, the stern expression, the hopeful glint in his eyes, the tight line of his lips, and the deep wrinkles on his forehead that always appeared when he was lost in thought. A determined light sparked in Janice's eyes. She reached out and squeezed Elliot's hand, mirroring the gesture he had offered her before, and smiled with a confidence that surprised even her. "You're destined for success. "Elliot," she said firmly, "I'll help you. Together we'll bring the farm to life just as your father dreamed. I promise." Elliot didn't say anything, but the hope in his eyes was unmistakable. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that things might turn out for the best. From that day forward, Elliot and Janice began working closely together, pouring their energy and resources into improving the farm. Janice's financial acumen and Elliot's hands-on experience proved to be a powerful combination. They invested in new cattle and equipment, carefully managing every detail, and before long the farm began turning a profit not just on paper, but in reality. Elliot was overjoyed by the progress, and as a token of his gratitude, he frequently brought Janice flowers, a small but meaningful gesture that brightened their days. The tradition of fixing up Janice's house was revived as well, with Elliot visiting almost every morning. In return, Janice prepared breakfast, and together they shared a quiet but cherished ritual that became the foundation of their deepening bond. A few weeks later, Christina visited Janice's house, a familiar folder of documents in hand. She handed them over with a look of concern. "Are you sure about this?" Christina asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. "More than sure," Janice replied, taking hold of the folder with a firm grip. "There's no turning back," Christina echoed, reminding Janice of the gravity of the decision. "I know," Janice said with resolve, "and I'm willing to take the risk." Christina didn't argue further, respecting Janice's determination. After everything they had been through, Christina was committed to supporting her friend in any way she could. Clutching the documents to her chest, Janice made her way to the farm, her heart racing with anticipation. Today was a big day. New equipment was arriving, and she was eager to share the news with Elliot. When she reached the farm, she found Elliot in his office, as usual, sitting at the table with papers spread out before him. He was engrossed in his work, but as soon as he saw Janice, a broad smile spread across his face, radiating pure happiness. "Janice," he greeted warmly, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "I have some exciting news," Janice said, unable to contain her enthusiasm. She handed him the folder, her eyes shining with the promise of what lay ahead. Elliot opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the papers inside. When realization dawned on him, his eyes widened, and he looked up at Janice, a mix of disbelief and joy on his face. "You did it," he whispered, almost in awe. "You did it." Janice nodded, her smile matching his. "We did it, Elliot. Together. The house, the farm, everything, it's all coming together. We're making this dream a reality." Elliot stood up, closing the distance between them in 2 quick strides, and pulled Janice into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me, in us. I couldn't have done this without you." Janice hugged him back, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. "We're just getting started," she whispered, knowing that their journey was far from over, but feeling confident that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "You're early," Elliot said, a warm smile on his face as he pulled out a chair for Janice. She sat down at the table, placing the folder of papers in front of him. "Read it," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation. Elliot took the folder and began to slowly leaf through the papers. With each page he turned, his eyes grew wider, and the weight of what Janice had done started to sink in. She watched him closely, biting her lip as she tried to gauge his reaction. When he finally closed the folder, he set it aside on the table and looked up at her, his expression one of disbelief. "What did you do?" he asked softly, his voice laced with emotion. "Did you buy the house?" Janice nodded, then stood up from her chair, moving to stand directly in front of him. She held his gaze, unflinching. "You didn't want it torn down. It was your friend's house, and I promised you it would work out." But that's a lot of money, Elliot exhaled, the reality of her gesture sinking in. It's my money, Janice replied, her voice firm yet tender. I can do whatever I want with it. Besides, I like the village, and... Before she could finish her sentence, Elliot closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was a kiss full of gratitude, love, and something deeper, an unspoken promise that they would face the future together. When he pulled away, Janice grinned up at him. Is that how you decided to thank me for the house? She teased. Is that what you think of me? He asked, his voice still husky from the kiss. No, she breathed, shaking her head. I was just joking. I bought this house for us. If you want us to be together, I think I'm in love with you. Love, Elliot echoed, his voice filled with wonder as he kissed her again, pulling her into a gentle embrace. Me too, he whispered, holding her close, as if afraid she might slip away. But the story wasn't over. Across town, Frank sat in a chair, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes staring straight ahead in disbelief. He was struggling to comprehend everything he had just been told. Are you telling me you made all this up to test me? Frank asked, his voice shaky as he looked at Janice, who sat across from him, her expression tinged with sadness as she sipped her tea. Yes, she replied quietly. There was a knock on the door, and Christina walked in, wearing a tight blue dress, her presence commanding the room. She looked directly at Frank and grinned, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. Well, did you tell him everything? Christina asked, her tone playful yet sharp. Too bad I couldn't see his face. I was a little late. Frank's face contorted with anger and confusion. So you knew everything? He bellowed. Christina's grin widened. Of course I did. I was the one who found the doctor, the one who paid for the diagnosis. Did you think Janice pulled all this off by herself? She loved you too much to do it alone. But you broke her heart, Frank. You thought you could treat her like garbage, and now you're facing the consequences. Frank sat there speechless as the full weight of his betrayal and the reality of Janice's strength and resolve hit him. The woman he had underestimated had orchestrated everything with the help of a loyal friend, all to reveal his true colors. Now, as he stared at Janice, he realized just how much he had lost his wife, her love, and any chance of redemption. Janice looked at him sadly, her heart no longer burdened by the man who had once held it captive. I wanted you to see who you were, Frank, she said, her voice steady. And now that you have, I hope you understand why I'm moving on. With that, she stood up, leaving Frank to grapple with the reality he had created, while she walked away, ready to embrace the future she had built with Elliot, a future filled with love, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. Frank pressed his lips together, trying to maintain his composure. You don't understand anything, Janice. I love you. Janice raised her eyebrows, a sarcastic grin forming on her lips. Doesn't Aisha suit you anymore? Or maybe she couldn't wait for you to open your own business and shower her with gifts. Frank opened his mouth to object, but the words died on his lips. He realized that excuses were futile. Instead, he tried a different approach. But how dare you play such a trick on us? With Mom, Frank's tone shifted to one of indignation. She was so upset when she found out you were sick. Christina and Janice exchanged a knowing look before bursting into laughter. Mrs. Pickles was hardly upset, Christina said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She practically ran ahead of everyone, gleefully announcing that her daughter-in-law was ill and would soon die. She was more interested in Janice's inheritance than anything else. Frank's eyes scanned the house, and suddenly a broad smile spread across his face. So you bought and earned all of this while you were married to me. Christina's expression darkened as she caught on to Frank's implication. She was about to argue, but Frank continued before she could speak. And since you acquired all of this during our marriage, he said slowly, half of the property is mine, right? Christina, being a lawyer, knew all too well how such situations typically ended. Her mind raced with possible legal strategies, but Janice had already stood up, her anger simmering just beneath the surface as she glared at Frank. She wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of his greed and deceit. But before she could say anything, the door opened and Elliot walked in. "Hi, dear," Janice said, her voice softening as she nodded towards him. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Elliot's expression immediately turned serious and furious, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an almost palpable anger. He stepped towards Frank, who instinctively backed away, his bravado quickly evaporating. "If you, idiot, decide to threaten Janice," Elliot said, his voice low and menacing, "I'll make your life a living hell with that." He grabbed Frank by the scruff of his neck and forcefully threw him out of the room. A moment later, they all heard the front door slam as Frank hurriedly retreated from the house. "Why did you let him in?" Elliot asked, his tone softening as he stepped closer to Janice and wrapped his arms around her from behind. In front of Frank, she had held herself together, refusing to show any sign of weakness, but everyone in the room knew how much she had suffered from his betrayal. Now, standing there with her head low, Janice fought back the urge to cry. "I should have told him everything," she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen the look on his face when he realized that my inheritance and I were out of his reach." "Did it make you feel better?" Christina asked gently. Janice nodded, finding some comfort in Elliot's strong and reliable embrace. "I'll file for divorce tomorrow." But despite Elliot's threats, Frank wasn't done. A few days later, a court notice arrived at the post office, and Elliot brought it back along with the rest of his documents. He handed the envelope to Janice with a grim expression. When she opened it and read the summons, her face turned pale. Frank had gone through with it. He was suing for divorce and demanding a division of property. Janice sank into a chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never imagined Frank would go this far. But then again, she hadn't thought he would abandon her to die either. He was unpredictable, and that unpredictability was now dragging her into a legal battle she had hoped to avoid. Elliot knelt beside her, his presence a calming force amidst the turmoil. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Janice looked into his eyes, finding strength in his unwavering support. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You won't have to find out," Elliot replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll fight this, and we'll win. You've already come this far, you're not going to lose now." With Elliot and Christina by her side, Janice knew she wouldn't be facing Frank's lawsuit alone. She would fight, not just for her property, but for the life she had started to build, free from the man who had betrayed her trust. And no matter how unpredictable Frank might be, she was determined to emerge from this battle stronger than ever. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense as Mrs. Pickles took the stand, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was so scared when she had her stroke. I didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for news from the hospital." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she dabbed them away with a white handkerchief. "And when I saw Janice, I almost had a heart attack myself. She didn't move, she was almost inanimate. I had to take care of her while Frank was working. I cleaned her, fed her, and..." Her voice broke as she sobbed, sitting back down on the bench. But then her tone changed, becoming bitter and accusatory. She wasn't sick. "The worst thing I could ever experience had already happened to me. My son and I have been betrayed and deceived, and now they want to leave me with nothing." Mrs. Pickles sobbed again, the weight of her words heavy in the room. Christina, standing confidently at the counsel's table, addressed the judge with measured calm. "Your Honor, you shouldn't take the word of the plaintiff and his witnesses at face value. To begin with, the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's adultery. The recording is admitted into evidence." The courtroom fell silent as the recording of Aisha and Frank's conversation played. The words of betrayal and scheming echoed through the room, the air thick with tension. A detective then took the witness stand, detailing Frank's infidelities and deceitful behavior. Mrs. Pickles, visibly shaken, jumped up from her seat, but the judge's stern warning made her sit back down, her distress palpable. Christina continued her argument, her voice unwavering. I would also like to point out that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff with medical documentation. She merely pretended to be ill to test him. No official certificates were provided. The doctor mentioned the diagnosis to the plaintiff and his mother without verification. Christina paused, letting the weight of her words settle before moving on. Furthermore, the plaintiff's claim that she took care of the sick defendant is contradicted by evidence. I have a recording of a conversation between Mrs. Pickles and her son. Please play it. The court listened intently as the recording played. Yes, Sonny. Feed her? Oh, I was reading, I completely forgot, but it's all right. She'll be fine anyway. She won't lose weight. What's up? Did you find a nurse for her? Good. The main thing is that she doesn't cost much, and the fact that she drinks. It's no big deal. The doctor said Janice won't last long anyway. As the recording ended, Christina resumed her argument. In addition, the plaintiff filed a petition for the division of the residence in the village, which was indeed purchased by the defendant. However, the defendant had already terminated her marital relationship with the plaintiff. They were living separately. And the funds used to purchase the house came from her inheritance, which was transferred from an account opened in her name by her grandmother. Therefore, the plaintiff has no rightful claim to this house. The remaining money in the defendant's account, as well as the share in the estate in Germany, are also part of the inheritance to which the plaintiff is not entitled. The judge's expression remained stoic, but Janice noticed a subtle change, an almost imperceptible grin, a hint of satisfaction. It gave her a small sense of relief, as if the judge was seeing through Frank's greed. Frank's claim sought an equal division of property between the former spouses, but Christina's case was strong, highlighting not only the defendant's rightful ownership of her assets, but also the questionable nature of Frank's claims. Suddenly, Frank's lawyer, a bold man with round glasses, leapt to his feet. "Objection," he exclaimed, his voice loud and commanding. "The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father." Christina nodded, acknowledging the point. "True," she said, her tone steady, "but according to the law, if one spouse has made substantial improvements to the property of the other spouse, it can be recognized as joint property." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Christina's words hung in the air. She continued, unflinching. "My client made significant financial contributions to the improvement of that apartment, including renovations and upgrades that greatly increased its value. Therefore, we argue that it should be considered joint property, subject to division." The judge leaned forward, clearly considering the arguments presented. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone awaited her ruling. Janice felt Elliot's reassuring presence beside her, his hand subtly resting on her back. She had faced so much deception, betrayal, and now this final legal battle. But as Christina expertly navigated the legal intricacies, Janice felt a growing sense of confidence. They were close to securing the justice she deserved, and no matter what Frank and his lawyer threw at them, she was determined to see this through to the end. As the courtroom quieted down, Frank's attorney stood and asked, "And what substantial changes were made to the apartment?" Christina stepped forward, her demeanor calm but confident. "Your Honor, we have visual evidence to support our claim. On the screen, you will see pictures of the apartment before it was renovated. As you can see, it was in a state of disrepair. These photos were taken exactly 1 year after the plaintiff and it were married. Now, here are the pictures of the apartment after the renovation, taken 6 months later." The stark contrast between the dilapidated condition of the apartment before the renovations and its transformed state afterward was undeniable. The room was filled with murmurs as the images were displayed, clearly showing the extensive work that had been done. Frank's attorney, however, was not easily deterred. And how do you prove that these renovations were funded by the defendant's money? Christina didn't miss a beat. During the renovation period, the plaintiff was not working. According to bank statements, his account did not contain the necessary funds for such extensive work. Furthermore, we have the testimony of the foreman who oversaw the renovations. The contract for the work was made on behalf of the defendant, further proving that the renovations were funded by her. The defense team continued to argue, bringing forth witnesses and attempting to counter Christina's claims, but the evidence was overwhelming. After lengthy deliberations, the judge left the courtroom, only to return a short time later with a large red file the verdict. The judge looked over the room before reading aloud. The court has ruled to grant the plaintiff's claim. 1/3 of the apartment is awarded to the defendant. The automobile will be held for joint use. And 50% of the funds from the plaintiff's account are awarded to the defendant. This judgment is final and not subject to appeal. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the room, sealing the decision. Frank and his mother glared at Janice with a mixture of anger and hatred, their expressions dark and vindictive. But Janice was no longer alone. Elliot wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, while Christina, grinning broadly, joined them. "I told you we'd take everything from him," Christina said, her voice carrying a strange mix of satisfaction and something darker, almost possessed. Elliot, holding Janice tightly, added, "It's rightfully yours, Janice, not his. Now, you and I have everything we've ever dreamed of." His smile was warm and reassuring, but there was a sense of finality in his words. Christina, gathering the papers, remarked with a hint of mischief, "It only remains to have a child, and the happiness will be complete." Janice looked down at her belly thoughtfully, stretching slightly. "Well," she said, a contemplative tone in her voice. As they left the courtroom, Janice felt the weight of everything that had happened lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just about the material things, they were secondary. What mattered most was the life she was building with Elliot, free from the deceit and betrayal that had once defined her marriage with Frank. The future that had once seemed so uncertain was now filled with possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, Janice felt a sense of peace and contentment. And that concludes the dramatic and emotional journey of Janice, Elliot, and Frank. From betrayal and heartbreak to justice and new beginnings, this story has taken us through the highs and lows of life's unexpected twists. Now, we want to hear from you. What have you learned from this story? Was it the importance of standing up for yourself, the power of loyalty, or perhaps the strength of building a future with someone who truly values you? Comment below and share one lesson you've learned from this story that you will bring into practice in your own life. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching.